Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about trad wives, or this. It's come up recently. It's a big issue, and there was a female, quite a successful, big following YouTuber who decided to, or so she claims, become a trad wife, and it kind of hasn't worked out so good. And so she's gone public and put her concerns and disquiet and disappointments into the public domain. Don't know if that's a good idea or not. But anyway, I'm going to mention or explore that just a little bit, but also touch on this idea of the trad wife. Is it realistically an option, a lifestyle option, or an option at all in terms of a way of living today in the West? So let's have a look at that and say, well, how many people can live as trad wives? Women can live as trad wives, assuming they want to. Is it a good thing to do it or not a good thing? If a woman doesn't go to work and have a career, does that mean, as Betty Friedan, the communist, Marxist, feminist, Jewish bisexual activist, said, that any woman that is a trad wife is living in a caged hell by capitalist evil Nazis. So exactly what you'd expect from a communist, Marxist journalist, activist. But anyway, she was given by Jewish publishing houses. She was given a lot of book publishing deals, the feminist mystique, or the feminine mystique rather, and that in the sort of, I think it was late 60s, early 70s, got fairly wide circulation, very heavily promoted, well beyond any of its literary merits that it may have had. It was heavily promoted by what we can see as the nascent sort of stirrings of the globalist cabal back then. Now, and this happened to coordinate perfectly with the new divorce laws that were coming in, that Ronald Reagan signed into law in California, and then became the blueprint for really the rest of the world on how to manage no-fault divorce. So anyway, trad wives. Now, I'm old enough. I lived in rural areas when I was a kid, smaller towns and so on. So they were, I guess, more traditional than the cities that tend to move a little bit quicker, and, as we would term, more progressive, or far more prepared to cast off the old casually to take on the new with equal devil may care casualness. But there was a number of things that happened to the trad wife, a number of forces that shaped society away from trad wifery. But the first and most obvious of those is the purchasing power of the paycheck. In 1970, the average working man, the guy who worked at the factory down the road, the paycheck that he got was enough to support a wife and 2.4 children, to have an annual vacation, to buy a house, to own a car. And so that was, if you like, in terms of wealth, wealth through the paycheck, that was probably the zenith of that era. And so the idea of a wife staying at home, or able to financially, it could be done, to stay at home, that was something that could be done then. It was a practical way. Now, if you wanted, things like childcare facilities didn't necessarily exist or weren't widespread back then, but children were far more independent. I remember walking to preschool and kindergarten, and that was so I'm like 4 or 5 years old or something. I remember walking to that. No one thought twice about it back in the day. So where it would be today, it would be unthinkable, but back then it was quite normal. So the very concept of childcare and having to protect children from supposed malevolent influences that are now, along with the far right extremists, are everywhere. most of it conjured up by political figures, as far as I can tell. But nonetheless, it was quite a different time, and there were different demands on time and different requirements. So the purchasing power of the paycheck made it quite eminently possible for a woman to live or to stay at home, look after the children, and keep house and buy the groceries. And so now, also remember at the time, extended shopping hours didn't really exist. So by the time the man finished work, the shops had all closed. So unless there was somebody sort of buying the groceries and the food and the other bits, unless there was someone keeping house, it was very difficult to find the time to go out and buy the groceries and do other things, pay the bills. So the man would give the money to his wife to pay the bill, or he would write out a check and post it, these sorts of things. Very different from how it is today. Now, I also remember, I'm old enough to remember my grandmother, who was brought up in the time of almost no or very few kitchen appliances. So she came from the era of you baked your own bread. You didn't go and buy it at the supermarket. Now, baking bread is actually a major undertaking by the time you knead the dough and add the flour and the fucking yeast and whatever else. And, and I remember her kneading dough for quite some time. The electric appliances, whether they be vacuum cleaners or whatever, they were starting to come around at the time. But my grandmother came from an era where they didn't exist. So there were, and the idea of going to the supermarket to buy things, the grocery store, that was, it was appearing, but it was still really in its infancy then, particularly in the rural areas. So where the populations were much more sparse, and it wasn't worth a supermarket chain putting a store in there. So you'd have a corner store that would order stuff in for you, like a general store, and they didn't have a whole lot there that you would. I remember my grandmother looking at catalogs. Oh, I'll have that. Oh yeah, it'll be in by Friday, Mrs. Billy Bob, and so there was a whole different concept in terms of how you would get your provisions and the like. And I remember butchers used to come around in a refrigerated van with cuts of meat hanging off hooks in the back of the van, and my grandmother would go out and I'll have that steak or this beef or that whatever, and she would pick it from the back of the butcher's van, and milk would be delivered and this sort of thing. So, or you would go to a farmer and get the milk. So very, very different sort of lifestyle altogether there. So what happened in going from the 1950s through into the 1960s, 70s, you had this revolution in home electrical appliances. A lot of people forget that. Now that drastically changed the amount of hours you needed to keep house. I remember my grandmother had one of those old washing tub things, and the rollers for drying. There was none of this spin drying, and none of that sort of stuff was around, or at least my grandmother didn't use it. I assume it was becoming available then. So I remember when she got her first electrical vacuum cleaner. I remember the oohs and the ahs that were, oh wow, hey, this is insane. It was viewed technologically as being a big leap forward, which it was really. So instead of baking your own bread, which was a big job, you could go to the grocery store and buy sliced bread, or you could go to the grocery store and you could get your meat and this and that and the fruit and vegetables all in a single pass. You didn't have to go to a whole bunch of different shops. In terms of things like washing machines for clothes, or I don't remember dishwashers back in the day. Other things, other electronic appliances, a mixing bowl. My grandmother got a mixing bowl. Formerly, she'd done it all by hand. And then she got this electronic mixer, and I remember the difference that made to the time that was spent in the kitchen. So by the time my mother was, with children, so she needed to spend, whereas my grandmother had to spend all day cooking and baking bread and this sort of stuff. By the time it came to my mother's era, if you like, then there were a whole bunch of electrical appliances. So she could go to work because the amount of time needed to be in the house and in the kitchen and in the, doing household stuff, that she didn't need as much time. So instead of 8 hours, for example, instead of 8 hours a day, it was 2 hours a day or an hour and a half a day. So that the time, because of automation in effect, because of these electrical appliances, and that was considered a revolution at the time, but it's forgotten about now. But I think it is. I see it as a huge revolution. It changed the entire architecture of the chores that needed to be done in the household. So the person doing the chores, the woman, the household chores, the person doing the chores was then able to have much more leisure time. Why should that leisure time not become work time? So you can see the interrelationship there on that side of things. Now, as the automation level, the electronic home appliances, as that sort of kicked off, and the also refrigerators, the size of refrigerators and their functions, their freezer boxes, things like that were also changing technologically. I still remember the days of people talking about they were having ice delivered, which seems insane, but in the rural areas that still went on. It's not like I'm a million years old, for goodness sakes. So now the next stage, sort of beyond that, was a lot of activism by the globalist capitalist class to say, well, look, we've got all these people now. They're not really needed in the home anymore, or certainly not to nowhere near the extent that they were. So why don't we get them working? So in that way, we create more workers and we create more consumers, which if you're a capitalist, what's wrong with that? The communists did the same thing, saying the Soviet Union, if everybody works, everybody consumes, it then creates a fairer society. It didn't quite work out that way, but that was the theory. In the capitalist societies of the West, this idea, well, we've got all this labor sitting around here, these workers, so we can get them to develop careers, get jobs, and this sort of thing. And men won't like it. That's not a problem because we will devise a system to control men. And if you look at everything from that time onwards, in any social change that's been forced, encouraged, pushed on the people without their consent, the first thing they do is we must control men. Men must be controlled in order for this to happen. Whether it's divorce, only men must be controlled. Whether it's putting women into, men must be controlled. Whether it's putting black lesbians in positions, men must be controlled. White men must be. So every step of the way, it's white men must be controlled. We see it today. White supremacy and white male and patriarchy and misogyny. It's all the same thing. White men must be controlled for us to force the social changes on a population that doesn't want those changes, that never voted for it, that never agreed to it, that we keep secret from them. We just say if it doesn't happen, that means you're all Nazis and so on. So, but coming back now to the trad wives thing, as women were entering the workforce, then wages were starting to stagnate and depress, but cost of living wasn't. So, and there were shifts in the cost of living. For example, consumer goods were coming down in price. So I remember, the first colour television that in the street that I lived in, which was a city at this time. The cost of a colour television was 6 weeks' wages, for example. Cost of this is average wage, so it would take 6 weeks of your, or somewhere around that, to buy a colour television. This is one of those cathode ray tube things, big thick I don't know, very old technology as we look back now, but it certainly wasn't flat screen or anything like it. So six weeks wages of the average wage to buy just one television, whereas today it's, unless you're buying particularly top of the range piece of kit, to buy that equivalent thing today would be less than 1 week's wage. So consumer goods, in the area of televisions, computers, the first personal computer I bought, I paid nearly $6,000 for it, and it was it was pretty decent. That's a 12-inch black and white screen, to give you an idea, and it had a clock speed of, I think it was 6 megahertz. And only had a floppy disk or maybe a 5 megabyte hard disk, which back then they called a mass storage subsystem. Whereas today I can get a computer that's a gazillion times more powerful for $600. To give you an idea of that. So consumer, a lot of, particularly in the area of electronics, consumer prices and consumer products have come down. Motor vehicles, for example, you get far more motor vehicle now that on a relative cost basis cost about the same now as it did then, but you get much far more. Back in the day, the entry level car had nothing. It didn't even have a radio, for goodness sake. You had to pay $500 extra or something for that. That sense, you get much more car now than you got back in the day for in purchasing power terms, about the same. But there are already shifts in other ways, shifts in price and costs. The price of real estate was increasing faster than wages. So wages were on a stagnation trajectory or downward trajectory. No, a stagnation trajectory. They never went down. They were just outstripped by costs. That's where the loss of purchasing power came. It wasn't that wages went down, it's the costs went up at a much faster rate than wages. So you see the trend, and it didn't really start to accelerate significantly until the mass migration began. But the forces were in play, just not to the same extent that they became when the mass migration kicked off. But as more and more women entered the workforce, the propaganda just was just avalanche levels propaganda of women that didn't work. The reason they didn't work is they were being oppressed by this evil, misogynist, fascist, Nazi, patriarchy man. That was why, which is almost exactly mirror image for the Soviet communist propaganda of the 1920s and 30s. When the Soviet Union was trying to rapidly industrialize, they needed workers, and so they intimated that the political party, the Bolsheviks, the communists, they were freeing women from the chains of the kitchen. The chains of the kitchen. That staying in the kitchen, capitalism. That is only Nazis do that. Whereas if you go and work at that, in that dirt floor factory, then that is social progress. So getting more women into the workforce and using insane levels of propaganda. And I remember it, as a kid reading some of the newspapers in the 1970s and 80s, or looking at what, and listening to some of the people that my folks knew, listening to some of the crap they were spouting about how if women worked, it was they could get away from their evil oppressor husbands and this sort of stuff. Oh wow, I don't think that's going to end in a good place. And it hasn't. So as the costs were increasing a faster rate than wages, the equation of what was affordable, could you afford to have support a wife and 2.4 children on a factory wage. Now, on top of that, wages, jobs that paid passably well, often due to overtime, but nonetheless, jobs that paid passably well and would have allowed a working class guy or just the ordinary Joe to support a wife and 2.4 children. And we're talking a basic house here, by the way, 3 small bedrooms, one bathroom, maybe a carport or something like that. We're not talking anything fancy, far from it. But it was a house. It was livable. It was warm. It was comfortable, and so on. So the jobs the working jobs that allowed that, what today in the US they call the Rust Belt jobs, that sort of thing, motor vehicle manufacturing or manufacturing generally, more the heavier end of the industrial scale. Those jobs were increasingly being moved offshore, and firstly, the Japanese became very, very prominent in motor vehicles. The American motor vehicle industry was very slow to respond to that challenge. And as a result, the share that American jobs had, or Western manufacturing, if you like, same as in Britain, Australia too, the jobs were, there was a net loss of jobs because of the increase in manufacturing. And again, Japan in particular was a player, and they just made better products at a better price. And they were quite innovative, things like transistor radios. That was primarily the original technology was American developed, but it was the Japanese who saw the potential for it and really cashed in on that. And then that microelectronics they then transferred to other things like musical record players, and back in the day cassette players and so on, and did very well out of it, by the way. So the jobs were being lost, the well-paying jobs were being lost for working men and lower middle class men in particular. And so the mix of jobs was changing as the costs were changing. So that brings us to today. And again, mass migration playing a huge part in this. But the amount of people that can afford the trad wife, and this is where we're really the pointy end of the discussion here, the amount of people from their income, if they inherit millions, that's different, but the amount of people from their income who can afford a trad wife. And I'll just do, I did some basic numbers here, and let me just, so in order to, this assumes you want to live in a middle-class suburb, and you can be at the lower end of the scale here, but let's take in Sydney. Let's assume you're a single sort of guy. You have to be in the top 1.2% of income earners in order to, if you're a single guy, to be able to afford to at the entry level of the middle class. You need to be able to carry a mortgage of over $60,000 a year. That's just the mortgage, by the way. And this assumes you have enough money to put the deposit down. So let's suppose you've got it on two incomes, then you're looking at somewhere around 15. Let's say two people on above average income. So you're looking at somewhere around 15% there. But you're not a trad wife. That's two incomes. There's no trad wife there. Let's suppose you want to have children where she is a trad wife for maybe even just till the children start school, for example. Then that means you need to, for 5 or 6 years or so, you need to carry the child or children while she stays at home. Now, because of the automation and all the other bits and pieces, she won't have really that much. There'll be things to do, of course. Looking after children, there are things to do. But she isn't going to have anywhere near the same sort of level and amount and time-consuming amount of chores there. So she's going to be, we'll refer to generically as a trad wife. She's going to, but that means that the guy is going to need to be in, say, 1 in every 300 level of income to support the trad wife. Unless you're living in a caravan or a trailer park somewhere, then that would be different. But assuming, again, you want to have a middle class lifestyle. So what we've got here, even if you want the lifestyle that was possible in 1970, say you go into the poorer outer suburban areas of Sydney where those sort of houses, the very basic small 3-bedroom house exist. Even there, if you look at the prices, there's not many people. There's still only, say, 25% of the population can afford that. Even there, it's such are the costs that a trad wife is simply not affordable. So it's no longer a social choice or something. Now it's different. Some people down the road from where we live, and they inherited two, got two quite decent inheritances in quite close succession. Now, she's got some, like she's a part-time receptionist or something, and she's pretty done. He's a labourer, and so they couldn't afford squat. But since they've got these inheritances, they've now bought a house. They've got no costs there. They've bought brand new, quite nice cars. They've got no costs there. They've actually renovated the place again, all paid for out of the inheritances. So they've decided to have children pretty much straight away. But it would be impossible for them to consider that outside of the inheritances. So the reality is that unless you're, one in every 250 or 300 sort of level of income, or you've got quite a generous inheritance, then you just can't afford it. The very concept of trad wife is inconceivable. Now, if you're prepared to live in penury, for example, the government gives you a house, like the housing projects, government gives you a house and then you can procreate and be a so-called trad wife, because for every new child you have, the government gives you more money. So now you won't be living an exotic lifestyle. You'll be living amidst crime and all sorts of unpleasantness, but it could be done, just as a purely sort of mechanical process. Now, coming now to the YouTube personality that. She says that the trad wife thing didn't work out, and she seems rather, or pretends to be rather, bewildered by it. I mean, it's Lauren Southern, you probably all know. Now, Lauren Southern had what, as I understand it, at the very least, she had quite a successful YouTube following. She was making documentaries. People were throwing money at her to make these documentaries. I don't know how much she was really making in the end. I got the impression that her fame sort of was outstripping her income somewhat. But anyway, she must have been doing okay out of it. It costs money to swan around the world and do these things, cameramen in tow and so on. So now, after all the expenses are met, maybe she didn't sort of make a lot of money, but I don't know. It seemed like she was doing fairly well. And if you've got that much following and that many, people watching your videos, the opportunity to make money must be there. So one day she decides that now, bearing in mind, Lauren would have not been unaware of the costs, what it costs to be a trad wife. Money doesn't just magically come out of the sky. And if you want to live the standard of living that I assume Lauren wanted to live, then you need a good income. You need a lot of money coming in the door. Back in the mid 1990s, I was getting paid nearly $200,000 a year. But when you've got the mortgage, the private school fees, the car payments, and all that sort of stuff, you think, well, that's a shitload, especially back in the day. That's a shitload of money. But by the time all the bills were paid, there wasn't that much left over. And then you throw in a few vacations that maybe I wouldn't rate as lavish, and the money goes pretty quickly. Not that anybody was going without, that was the suits I was wearing were sharp suits and so on, but nonetheless, so and there's no way you could do it on $200,000 a year today. That sort of, no, it just couldn't be done. If you want to live in the $2.5-3 million house, in the nice middle class Tree Line Street area, you can't do it. Only you need double that sort of income to live that lifestyle. Again, unless you've got inheritance. Coming back to Lauren now, as I understand it, and I hope I've understood it correctly, Lauren gives up being a successful YouTube star and decides to marry, out of all people, a policeman. So now, unless you're at the very apex of unless you're like the city police commissioner or something, being a police officer doesn't really pay that well. And she would have been aware of, give or take what the guy's salary was. But she decides, I'm going to give up my YouTube life, marry a policeman on a low income, and be a trad wife. Now, again, you don't need to be a mathematical genius to know that that's going to be a tough gig. So unless she's inherited a free house or made enough money from the other stuff that your bigger expenses, such as your house, like you don't have to pay a mortgage or a rent or something like that. As long as you got all those expenses covered, you're good to go. Then the expenses living day to day, if you don't have to think about paying a mortgage, then your expenses, that mortgage being between half and 2/3 of the expenses of living day to day. These, if you don't have that, then you can get by on a fairly ordinary income. You may not live lavishly, but you can get by. Lauren Southern has I think it's one child, as far as I know, and so she sort of thinks that, or as if I've understood the sort of proclamation she's made, is that the relationship with the husband, might now be the ex-husband, I suppose, became rather strained, and he was locking her out of the house, and his behaviour, as she describes it, is somebody who was behaving very strangely. It's difficult to imagine you wouldn't have some inkling of that early on. Why would Lauren or anyone marry somebody where it was, on balance of probability, likely that they would behave strangely at some point? I don't know why you'd do that. Why would you give up a very promising YouTube career to marry someone on a low income and then say you want to be a trad wife, when you would know well in advance that you can't be a trad wife on that sort of income, that two incomes are needed as a basic, and so on. So there are a lot of things that don't add up about that. But the bottom line is, on the sort of income that this, assuming he's the policeman that's described, the income would be nowhere near enough to play the trad wife. So it was always the case that she was going to have to work and bring in an income, simply because it's no longer affordable for anyone to be a trad wife unless you're the richest half of 1%. And that's really the argument about trad wives. No one can afford it anymore. That's why there are so few trad wives. It's purely a matter of economics, not lifestyle choice. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.